Have you ever had that tiny, nagging feeling, one you almost ignore because it seems too small to matter, only for it to grow until it fills every quiet moment of your life? I have. These are three true things that happened to me, three separate times where a detail that should have stayed insignificant became the thing that would not let me sleep. Each one is real. Each one left an image I still see when the house is quiet. Listen close. I'll tell them as they happened to me. Story 1. The Woods with Rosco. I'd been planning that solo trip for months. Winter had finally set in, the kind that makes the world thin and brittle, and I wanted to get away from the noise and reset. Rosco came with me, a lanky, half-German shepherd rescue who had the kind of ears that heard everything. We drove until pavement turned to packed snow, then followed a narrow trail into a stand of tall pines. The sky was iron gray, breath steamed white. I set up close to a ridge where a deadfall made a natural windbreak. I dug a shallow pit for the fire, stacked wood, tightened the tent lines. Everything was neat, deliberate, maps checked, flashlight batteries fresh, extra food in a waterproof bag. By dusk, the world was quieter than I expected. Sound in winter is strange. It carries, but it's flatter, like an old radio. Rosco lay with his nose on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. We ate, I tightened the knots on the tent, and when the fire had eaten down to embers, I crawled into the sleeping bag. The kind of cold that makes your blood slow was everywhere, but I was sleep lighter when I'm out in the open, so I wasn't completely surprised when a low set of barks woke me just after midnight. Roscoe's bark was different, not the come-play bark or the annoyed bark at a raccoon. This was short, quick, repeated. He stood, hackles up, facing the tree line. I unzipped the tent and peered out. Beyond the ring of firelight, the trees made a wall of black. At the tree line, at the very edge where the trunks thinned and the moonlight hit the snow, there was a shape. For a long, frozen moment, it could have been a deer. It could have been a tree stump. It wasn't. It was a man, standing, perfectly still, facing towards us. I should say here that I wasn't naive about danger. I had a legal means of protection with me, but I keep it as a last resort, and I don't like to pull it unless there's no other choice. That night, I remember thinking about the kinds of choices you make when you're alone in the dark. The practical ones, like whether to call out, and the stupid ones, like picturing what might happen if you do. I called out, low at first. "Hey," I said. No answer. I tried again, a little firmer. The figure did not turn. Roscoe's growl moved under my skin. For maybe 10 seconds, the man stood there like a statue. Then he stepped back and vanished into the trees. Not a run, not a hurry, just a slow fade between trunks. I watched until the outline was gone, and the only movement was snow falling from a branch, settling like ash. I told myself it was someone lost, maybe a hunter passing through. It seemed plausible. The woods have all kinds in the winter. I tried to fold the moment into a reasonable explanation. Rosco didn't accept any explanation. He refused to go back to rest. He paced, ears swiveling toward the tree line. I slid a flashlight under my arm, double-checked the zipper, and sat awake until the embers went cold. Hours later there were footsteps. Not loud, not heavy, but different from deer or snow settling. The tread of someone moving on packed snow, careful and deliberate, coming closer in a way that made the blood in my neck rush. Roscoe's single howl cut through the dark. He stood at the tent door rigid, nails a whisper on the fabric. I whispered a command to him, though I knew we were beyond normal obedience. My voice felt like paper in that thin air. The footsteps paused at the edge of my campsite. Someone crouched near my tent, and the fabric tightened as a gloved hand brushed the nylon. There are small sounds that you will never forget. The scratch of fabric, the slight inhale of air, the click of a boot when someone shifts weight. I felt all of it like a slow film over my face.
Gripped by panic and adrenaline, I told myself to be loud. I shook the tent zipper and yelled until I thought my throat would split. I said words I wish I could take back, tough-sounding stuff, the kind of bravado you use to convince yourself to be brave. The footsteps left, quick, then gone. I didn't sleep. I sat with Rosco through the murky, tall hours, taking tiny sips of warm water to stop my mouth from going dry. When the first color pushed through the trees, I packed fast, the way you collect things you aren't sure you'll return to. We left a mess behind, the dead embers, a half-eaten can of soup in the snow. I could have returned the same way, but the campsite felt different now. Small spaces take on new meanings when someone else has stood in them, in the center of your light, at the edge of your tent, and then left as quietly as he arrived. That image of the man at the tree line is one I replay when silence sits too long in a room. Not a face to place blame on, not a reason to explain it away, just a silhouette in the space between safety and the dark. I never went back to that ridge. Rosco still watches the edges of the yard on windy nights, ears pricked, and sometimes I wonder whether he remembers that winter as clearly as I do. If this is getting to you and you want more, take a second to like the video and stick around for the next two, because the second story got stranger. Story 2, The Man in the Wedding Suit. A few months after the woods, I went to Charleston with my friend Mark. It was supposed to be the kind of trip where the only worry is what restaurant to try for dinner. We laughed, walked the cobblestone streets, bought coffee at a place that smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. The city thrummed with tourists and locals. Kids chased pigeons by the market, and fishermen walked the piers with the kind of easy confidence that comes from knowing a place for years. We spent a day near the waterfront, sun low and golden. There were vendors with handmade jewelry, and a man playing slide guitar under a canopy. Mark and I wandered through narrow lanes between storefronts, the kind of place where you can get lost in a neat way. The first time I saw him, he was only a flicker at the edge of my vision. A man in a suit, but not the kind you would expect on the cobblestones in late afternoon. It was a wedding suit, crisp, almost new-looking, white shirt and a dark jacket that fit perfectly. He moved through the crowd in a way that made no sense, as if he belonged to an earlier scene. When I looked directly, he was gone. At first we laughed it off. Charleston has a theatrical streak. Sometimes people dress up for parties or photo shoots. Mark told me maybe it was a groom taking wedding portraits, which made the moment less eerie. But then I kept seeing him. Not always on the same street, but always the same suit, that same rigid way of carrying himself. Once at a busy outdoor market, he moved through a tight circle of people as if he was parting a curtain. No one bumped him, no one noticed. He did not look at the wares, he didn't speak, he just walked. When he turned a corner and I caught him out of the corner of my eye, he seemed to slow and glance back. Not a glance toward me exactly, but the way a person might look at a house they've left for the last time. It settled in my stomach like cold iron. We spent the evening at a bar where jazz played softly and strangers kept to their own conversations. Mark made a joke about me getting spooked, and I laughed because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. We walked back to the apartment we had rented. The streetlights threw long, warm pools on the sidewalks. I remember the sound of wheels on wet cobblestones and the smell of fried food from a late-night stand. From the window of the small living room, I watched people pass. It was late, and most of the faces were ordinary. Students, a couple holding hands, a delivery guy with a boxed pizza. Then he was there again. Not at the corner where I'd seen him earlier in the day, but 2 blocks away, moving with that same deliberate gait. He paused, and for the first time I saw him turn his head and look directly at the building where we were sleeping. His eyes were not angry. They weren't alive with intent the way an angry person's might be. They were calm, empty almost, like someone reading a page they'd read before. I woke at some point to a faint noise and pulled back the curtain. He was closer now, standing under the sodium light of a street lamp, the suit catching a cold gleam.
My phone logged the time in my head, late enough that the city should have been quieter, but he didn't move away when he saw the light in the window. He simply walked across the street and turned down an alley, and then he was no longer visible. We stayed an extra day, convinced ourselves we had seen performative oddities, an actor, a man who loved vintage clothing. But on the drive home, the city rolling by in long trains of interstate, the image that refused to leave was not the one of a man in a suit seen twice and dismissed. It was the final image of him looking toward my window with that soft, steady attention. It's a small thing, but that kind of attention is not polite curiosity. It lingered like a shadow after the sun goes down. There are moments that make you reevaluate what public means. That night in Charleston, I felt exposed in a way I never had, like a private scene played out in a place where strangers pass by every second. The man in the wedding suit never approached us. He never said a word. He might have been on his way somewhere else entirely, but the way he moved through people, unnoticed yet somehow present, is an image that sits in the back of my mind when I walk past a crowd. It is the idea that you can be watched by someone who never needs to enter your space to make you feel invaded. Story 3: The House Intruder and the Photo. The deadbolt on the back door felt loose. The handle worked oddly, catching on the jamb. I found a long hair in the kitchen sink that was not mine. I took the dog for a longer walk, thinking that a routine shake-up might help me feel less trapped by paranoia, and yet I came home with the sensation that someone had watched me leave. I called a locksmith and had the locks changed. I installed a more secure deadbolt. I slept with a chair under the door as some kind of old-fashioned fail-safe, an absurd little barricade that made me laugh once and then did nothing to calm my breathing. At 4 in the morning, the kind of time where every sound is enormous, I woke to a tap at my bedroom door. It was methodical, like someone waiting for permission to come in. I sat still and listened. The tapping came again. Soft, regular. I can still hear the rhythm in my head. 3 taps, a long pause, 2 taps. My phone lit with the time, 3:47 a.m. I called out, voice low and raw. The tapping stopped for a beat, then moved along the hallway, and then there was a shifting, the scrape of something along wood. I remember thinking that the house sounded like it had been dressed for someone else, the hush of a stair, a skittering in the vents. At the foot of the stairs, I found the back basement door cracked, the kind of crack that lets a sliver of night into a room and makes you notice things you had not before, how the basement smelled of damp and old boxes, how the insulation was pulled loose at the edges. There was a faint outline on the threshold, the outline of a shoe where snow had sealed and melted in place. The outline matched the footprints I'd seen on the back step weeks earlier. It was not the prints of an animal or the erratic drag of a raccoon. It was a human tread. I called the police. They arrived, moving through the house with a purposeful quiet. Rosco hid under a bed and refused to come out. They found evidence that someone had been spending time in the basement. It was horrible in the ordinary way that basements can be when someone is using them like shelter. Food wrappers hidden under boxes, a nest of insulation pulled together like someone had tried to make a bed, small personal items left in corners. The officers told me they'd arrested a man in the basement that night. He was barefoot and disoriented. He had no explanation that made sense. He said he was lost, then said nothing at all. He was taken by the authorities. I won't say more about the legal side, because I don't know the details, and I don't want to claim a resolution I don't have. What followed was the thing that unsettled me the most. A few weeks after the arrest, when the house felt half repaired and I was trying to re-establish normal rhythms, my phone chimed with a notification from one of the cloud backups. Someone, or something, had synced a photo. I opened it. It was a simple, terrible image. Me, asleep on my back, a single beam of streetlight cutting the room in half.
The timestamp in the corner said 3:11 a.m. I sat bolt upright, and the world condensed into that number. I knew what my own sleeping posture looked like. I knew the pattern of my breath. The picture was taken from a low angle, the perspective of someone sitting or crouching a few feet away from the bed. There was no explanation for how it had appeared on my phone backup. The police logged it as evidence. The hair on my arms stood up in a way that felt like a warning. The discovery of that photo changed the shape of my home. I started to notice the small things that had once been normal and now felt like evidence. How curtains hang, the sound of a vent, the way the back door clicks when the wind shifts. I installed better lighting, motion sensors, a camera on the back step. I also noticed the ways trauma rewrites your life in quieter ways. The way I would check each room before I sat down. The unease that made me keep my phone on the nightstand even when it buzzed in the middle of the night. Sleep did not return to me for months without a list of rational checks and ritualized routines. There's a phrase I keep hearing in my head: violation of private space. That small phrase keeps multiplying into the gestures that show what it means. When a person crosses the threshold, not by force, but by stealth, by presence, by the quiet occupation of your periphery. The man that night never hurt me physically, at least not in a way I can point to. What he left behind was a map of presence, traces that said someone had been there when I was not, and a photograph to prove it. That was worse than any single violent act. It rewired the way I see my own house. Closing. All three of these moments share something. The small things that should have been harmless, but were not. A silhouette at the tree line. A man who wore a suit like a memory and stepped through a crowd unseen. The unplugged charger, the faint prints, the photograph at 3 a.m. Each of those tiny signs added up until the world I knew began to look like it was made of fragile barriers rather than solid walls. What haunts me most isn't a clear face or a dramatic confrontation. It's the way those small moments refuse to go away. The image of a shape where it should not be. The steady, calm look toward a window. A photo that proves someone was closer to your bed than you ever knew. Those things live in the afterimage of my life. They make me check the locks one more time. They make me walk the yard at night with Rosco at my side. They shift arrangements on the couch because the right angle makes me feel less exposed. If there's anything I took from these experiences, it's this: pay attention to the little things. I do not mean to tell you to become fearful or to live in paranoia. I mean notice. Notice when the world gives you a small, persistent signal that something is off. Sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's a man at the tree line. Sometimes it's a picture you didn't take.
All I can tell you is that these 3 true stories changed the way I live in the world, and they left images that I still cannot fully erase. If you want more real stories like these, subscribe and stay with me. And tonight, when you switch off the light, you might find one of these images waiting in the dark. Just a shape at the edge, patient and unhurried, refusing to leave.